Charlie Kirk, one of the most polarizing and controversial conservative figures in the United States, was shot dead during a public event in Utah, an incident that shook not only the political stage, but also the collective psyche of a society already torn apart by division and hostility. What was supposed to be a regular conference with thousands of attendees instantly turned into a scene of chaos and terror, a tragedy that spread across social media in real time, leaving behind shock, fear, and a flood of questions about how such an act could even happen. The central question is not simply who pulled the trigger, but what chain of psychological and social mechanisms led a human being to decide that ending another person's life was an acceptable or necessary course of action. Beyond the cold facts of the news, we must look deeper into the mind of the aggressor and into the toxic environment that shaped both his perception and his final decision. Because acts of violence do not appear in isolation. Political attackers are not born overnight. They are cultivated through years of accumulated frustrations, exposure to extremist narratives, constant feelings of alienation, and the belief that society is controlled by enemies who must be confronted with force. When a person stops perceiving the speaker on stage as a fellow human and instead as the absolute embodiment of everything evil, the process of dehumanization is complete, and violence becomes rationalized in the distorted mind of the perpetrator. Dehumanization is one of the most dangerous psychological shifts, because once the other ceases to be seen as a person with feelings, family, and complexity, harming them no longer triggers the natural brakes of empathy that normally stop us. American society has become dangerously polarized, with opposing camps no longer viewing each other as adversaries in a debate, but as existential threats that must be eliminated. And this radical mentality sets the stage for tragedies like the one in Utah. The media landscape, fueled by social platforms, magnifies anger and division. Every viral post, every speech that sows fear and resentment acts as fuel for individuals who are already on the edge of desperation. For vulnerable minds, the daily exposure to narratives of hatred creates an alternate reality, a mental world where violence no longer feels like a crime, but like a duty to restore order or deliver justice. In the case of Charlie Kirk, we do not yet know the exact motive of the shooter, but we understand the general mechanisms that allow such acts to occur. Frustration mixed with ideology, personal despair, fused with collective rage, and the collapse of empathy. Many assassins are not simply political fanatics, but also individuals carrying deep wounds, whether psychological, economic, or social, and violence becomes the distorted outlet for unresolved pain. When society ignores these warning signs, when anger becomes the main currency of political discourse, then the risk of bloodshed grows silently until one day it explodes in front of thousands of witnesses. It is crucial to recognize that such violence is not just the act of one isolated individual, but the product of an ecosystem of toxicity, where rhetoric, polarization, and systemic neglect work together like invisible architects of destruction. The collective anger of a divided nation does not remain abstract. It seeks expression, and when one individual becomes the vessel of that anger, tragedy becomes inevitable. When thousands cheer aggressive rhetoric or share hateful messages online, responsibility is not limited to the lone shooter, but spreads across all who normalize the culture of hostility. That is why this analysis is not only about a man shot dead and a hidden gunman. It is about the psychology of an entire society standing on a knife's edge between debate and destruction. Fear, hatred, and polarization together form an explosive cocktail, and the tragedy of Charlie Kirk illustrates how fragile the line is between political conflict and outright violence. Every time a leader is portrayed not as a political opponent, but as a monster, a tyrant, or a threat to the very survival of the people, someone in the audience may decide to act violently in the name of that illusion. This event forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Our societies are not immune to violence. Our democracies are not indestructible. And the human mind can be driven to extreme acts when flooded with enough anger and fear. The psychology of mass polarization is simple but devastating. People cluster into echo chambers, amplify their resentments, demonize outsiders, and slowly lose the ability to perceive nuance, empathy, or compromise. When all dialogue breaks down, the battlefield becomes the only remaining metaphor, and from metaphor to reality, the distance can be as short as a single bullet. The shooter may have believed he was striking down an enemy of the people, But what he truly revealed was the deep fracture within the human soul when consumed by narratives of division. And in that sense, every act of political violence is not only an attack on one person, but also a mirror reflecting the sickness of the society in which it occurs. Psychologically, we know that violence is rarely spontaneous. It is usually preceded by long processes of radicalization, isolation, and reinforcement of extremist ideas, often enabled by digital communities that reward outrage. The human brain is highly plastic, and when fed daily with messages of fear and hatred, neural pathways of empathy weaken, while pathways of aggression become stronger, reshaping the very architecture of thought. At some point, a tipping point is reached, where violence feels less like a crime and more like a mission, less like murder and more like duty. And that is the terrifying psychology behind political assassinations. Society often asks how such acts could have been prevented, and the answer lies not only in better security, but in addressing the roots: alienation, mental health neglect, toxic rhetoric, and the glorification of enemies. Prevention requires more than metal detectors and police officers. It requires a cultural shift where disagreement does not mean demonization and debate does not mean war. For ordinary people, the lesson is also personal. Every time we share a hateful post, laugh at dehumanizing jokes, or celebrate the suffering of the other side, we contribute in tiny ways to the culture that makes bullets fly. Charlie Kirk's death is not only a political moment, it is a psychological case study in how words, emotions, and divisions can build invisible weapons long before a gun appears in someone's hands. This event reveals the deep fragility of the human condition, that beneath the surface of civilization, our instincts for fear and aggression can be triggered and manipulated until they erupt violently. In the end, this tragedy is a wake-up call, not just for America, but for all societies drifting into polarization. Because what happened in Utah is not an American problem alone. It is a human problem. We must ask ourselves, are we building a world where empathy can still hold power? Or are we building a battlefield where everyone is an enemy waiting to be eliminated? History shows that societies that normalize hatred eventually implode, and no ideology, whether conservative or progressive, is safe from the destructive fire once it begins to spread. That is why we need to relearn the psychology of dialogue, to practice listening even when we disagree, and to resist the temptation of painting our opponents as monsters. Because once the mental step of dehumanization is taken, the physical step of violence is never far behind. Charlie Kirk's assassination may be remembered as a political story, but psychologically, it must be remembered as a warning, a reminder that human minds are fragile, and societies built on anger are always one spark away from collapse. If there is one lesson to take, it is this: violence begins in words, in emotions, in unchecked fears, and if we want to prevent future tragedies, we must start by healing the wounds within ourselves and our communities. Otherwise, we will continue to repeat the same cycle of shock, mourning, and forgetting, while more lives are cut short and more societies are torn apart. The tragedy of Utah is not the end of the story, but the middle of a dangerous trajectory, and only by confronting the psychological roots of hatred can we hope to change its outcome. As viewers, we must resist being passive consumers of shocking news. We must engage actively with the underlying issues and reflect on how we, in our own daily lives, contribute to the culture of division or healing. Because every share, every comment, every conversation shapes the mental environment in which future decisions of peace or violence will be made. And that makes each of us responsible, not only as witnesses, but as participants in the unfolding story of humanity. Charlie Kirk is gone, but the questions remain, and those questions are more important than the names and headlines, because they touch the core of what it means to live together in society. So let us use this tragedy not as another reason to hate, but as a mirror in which to see our own flaws, our own anger, and our own capacity for change. And let us remember, healing is possible, but only if we choose it, day after day, in the way we think, the way we speak, and the way we see those who disagree with us. If you have stayed with me until now, it means you care about more than just the surface of the news. It means you seek meaning, understanding, and truth beyond the headlines. So subscribe, because here we go deeper. Here we confront the uncomfortable questions, and here we search not only for information, but for transformation.